Hi, often we just want to escape the city and find peace in the midst of nature, but sometimes that peace is driven away by something unsettling. Here are 3 true and terrifying camping stories. When my cousin Ethan and I were in our early 20s, we took some camping trips around Washington state. I believe this happened when I was 22 and he was 23, and it was in the Olympic National Forest. It was my first time camping there, but not his. It was midweek, and our jobs allowed us to take days off during that time, so we usually went to avoid traffic and crowds. I always let Ethan take the lead on these trips. He was the scout, not me. We parked near a picnic area and entered the forest from there. After about 15 minutes of hiking, we found a good spot to set up camp. A good spot meant a clearing large enough for 2 tents, the portable stove, and a campfire. The first thing we did was unpack our things and set up the tents. Ethan was always much faster than me at setting up a tent. He could do it in a few minutes, while I always took over 20 minutes. Or rather, I always used to, since I haven't gone camping in the wild since then. The next thing we did was create a stone ring for the campfire, and then gather some kindling and firewood. He brought a fire starter and a lighter, so I guess we kind of cheated, but that's okay. It was that time of day when the sun was setting. We had a fire going and Ethan was preparing some steaks and hamburgers. One thing about Ethan is that he always put a lot of effort into the food on these trips, and he was a great cook, so I always trusted him to feed us. Of course, we had bear spray in case the smell of food attracted a black bear, which Ethan always said was very unlikely. He always said that the real concern in the middle of the forest is other people. While we ate our steaks and hamburgers, we opened some beers and played classic rock on the speaker. If you've never been camping, you don't understand how good moments like these are in nature. With a friend or family member, a few beers, reminiscing about good times, and enjoying the music. When it got dark, we started playing cards on a folding table we had brought specifically for that. After playing a few traditional card games, we started playing Uno, and that's when we heard something in the forest. I paused the music on my phone so the speaker would go silent. Now it was clear. We heard a faint, distorted voice humming, and footsteps coming from beyond the trees, in the total darkness of the forest. Ethan asked me to find the flashlight. I tried, but by the time I found it, the sounds had already disappeared. I asked Ethan if that was something to worry about, and he said it was definitely unusual for someone to be that deep in the forest, especially walking creepily near a campsite with a lit fire, humming loudly. I was a bit shaken, and I could see Ethan was too. We went back to playing cards with the music much quieter now. When we least expected it, a large stick fell right in the middle of our campsite, making both of us jump in shock. It didn't fall from a tree. Someone threw it at us. Ethan started yelling something like, "Whoever's out there messing with us, get a life," and then the footsteps could be heard again in the distance, moving away from us. I said we should pack up the camp and go somewhere else. He said absolutely not in the dark. We both had bear spray, and he advised me to keep it by my side in the tent when we went to sleep. It was the closest thing we had to self-defense weapons. We kept hearing sounds like tree branches snapping in the distance, sounds you wouldn't expect an animal to make. Someone was out there. That much was clear. We had to sleep eventually, so we agreed that maybe we should take turns keeping watch to make sure no one came into our camp to steal something or worse. Ethan agreed to take the first watch. He said he'd stay awake reading his book. So I got into my tent, and then into my sleeping bag, and went to sleep. Waking up in the middle of the night while camping is normal. You're in a cold outdoor environment and in an uncomfortable sleeping bag. Anything can wake you up. I still didn't know what had woken me. I was still half asleep, my brain not fully awake. I looked up and saw a head peeking into my tent. It looked like Ethan. I rubbed my eyes, but it was the darkness that kept me from seeing his face clearly. I said, "Ethan?" thinking he was waking me up to take over the watch. "Is it my turn?" I kept staring at the head watching me from inside the sleeping bag, slowly waking up more with each passing second. Then I heard the tent zipper close quickly, and the head disappeared. I lay back down in the sleeping bag, but only for a second. Suddenly, I had a moment of clarity and sat up quickly, hearing footsteps moving away. "Ethan?" I said. He didn't answer. I unzipped the tent to peek out at the campsite. The fire was out. Ethan wasn't there. I went over to his tent, which was closed. I unzipped it and looked inside, and there was Ethan, fast asleep in his sleeping bag. I got goosebumps, chills, whatever you want to call it. I started shaking him to wake him up, and when he finally woke up, I said, "There's something here at the campsite." It took him a minute to come back to reality, just like it had for me, but when he did, he grabbed his bear spray. He said he must have dozed off while reading. He told me I should sleep in the tent with him that night, but to do that, I'd need my sleeping bag. He got out of the tent with me and kept watch while I ran to grab my sleeping bag. Inside my tent, grabbing my sleeping bag, I heard that damn humming again outside. I grabbed the bag, and Ethan whispered for me to hurry. "Did you hear that too?" I said. He nodded. We both went back to his tent and zipped it up, with our cans of bear spray by our side. Throughout the night, we heard scratching outside the tent and footsteps circling around. As soon as the sun began to rise, we packed up our things and left. We never went back to that forest. A few months later, we researched the area and found old accounts of a spirit called Stick Indian, an entity from local indigenous folklore that mimics human voices to lure victims into the forest. The memory of that head peeking into my tent still haunts me to this day. When my older brother Dan and I decided to go on a hike to camp in a remote area of the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas, we had no idea the terrifying experience that awaited us. Our intention was to disconnect from the world and challenge our limits. We carried backpacks loaded with supplies and hiked for over an hour to reach an isolated spot deep in the forest, far from any conventional trail. The place seemed perfect. A spacious clearing surrounded by tall, dense oak trees. After setting up the tent and organizing the site, we explored the surroundings for a while, enjoying the tranquility of the environment. The silence was almost absolute, except for the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional song of a distant bird. As night approached, Dan suggested we do something different. Instead of just eating and relaxing like on other trips, we challenged ourselves to tell horror stories. The idea was simple. Each of us would tell a scary story while the other tried not to be impressed. It sounded fun, so I agreed. While Dan talked about a local legend, we lit the campfire and roasted some sausages on skewers. But our fun was interrupted by a strange sound coming from the forest, a discordant and unsettling sound. We thought it might be something in our minds. Dan tried to laugh it off, saying it could be a lone hiker or even an animal, but something about it didn't seem normal. The sound came and went, always getting a little closer. Suddenly, a loud noise of a branch snapping right next to our campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness between the trees. Nothing. Dan grew serious and whispered that we should keep the fire going and stay alert. The noises continued for a while. Light footsteps, the sound of branches breaking, the noise of the wind blowing and the fire crackling. We tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But the tension was palpable. It had been night for some time, and even though we thought it might just be our imagination, we hadn't been able to sleep and were on alert outside the tents. That's when I felt like something was watching me. I got up from where I was sitting, standing with my back to the fire, staring into the darkness of the forest. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and to my horror, I saw a pale face with glowing eyes peering out from between the trees. "Dan!" I shouted in fear. Dan, startled, asked, "What's going on?" and ran toward me with his pocket knife, yelling, "Go away! Leave us alone!" Terror took hold of us, and whatever that thing was, it dashed back into the forest. We stayed on alert for a while longer and then decided to get inside the tent. We've always shared one since we were kids, and it's been that way ever since. After some time, unable to fall asleep, we heard footsteps circling around us. We couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun began to light up the clearing, we got up and tried to find any traces or footprints, but we found nothing. I've been camping for a long time, and I'm sure that thing wasn't an animal or a human. In the fall of 2022, I and 3 friends decided to take a camping trip to Yellowstone National Park, one of the wildest and most inhospitable places in the United States. Me, Ethan, Lucas, and Ryan were experienced adventurers, and we were eager to spend a few days away from civilization, surrounded only by the imposing nature of the park. We wanted a greater challenge, so we chose a remote location, off the conventional trails. The hike to the campsite was long and exhausting. We carried heavy backpacks for over 2 hours, crossed icy streams, and traversed uneven terrain until we found a perfect clearing, surrounded by giant pine trees and with an incredible view of the mountains in the distance. The place seemed ideal, secluded from other visitors, quiet, and seemingly safe. We set up the tents, built a campfire, and enjoyed the first night under a starry sky with no sign of danger. The first few days were peaceful. During the day, we explored the forest, fished, and admired the wild beauty around us. At night, we sat around the campfire, telling stories and relaxing. But on the third night, everything changed. Around midnight, while we were playing a game of telling scary stories, we heard a strange noise coming from the forest. First, the rustling of leaves, then the sharp crack of a branch breaking. Ryan, always skeptical, laughed and said it was probably a deer, but the noise was too heavy for a small animal. Lucas grabbed his flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound, but all we saw were dense shadows among the trees. We tried to ignore it and continue the conversation, but about an hour later the sound returned, this time closer. Slow, heavy footsteps circled our campsite. The silence among us was immediate. The air grew thick, filled with a strong, strange smell. My heart raced when Ethan, wide-eyed, whispered, "That's not a deer." Before we could react, a deep, menacing growl echoed through the forest. The sound sent a chill down my spine. It was a bear, and by the sound of it, not a small one. My hands trembled as we put out the campfire, trying to minimize our presence. We started moving slowly toward the tents, but then, out of the darkness, emerged a massive figure. The moonlight reflected in the creature's eyes, and a shiver ran through my body. The bear rose on its hind legs, revealing its enormous stature. My chest tightened. We were vulnerable, defenseless against that beast. Lucas, in pure desperation, grabbed an emergency flare and lit it. The intense light illuminated the animal's face, its massive teeth, its wild eyes. The bear roared loudly, a guttural, threatening sound that reverberated deep within me. For a moment that felt like an eternity. No one moved. The flare's brightness and the loud noise seemed to bother it. The bear hesitated, snorted, and after a few seconds, which felt like years, turned and retreated into the darkness of the forest. We stood frozen, just listening to the sound of its footsteps fading away. No one slept that night. We just sat there, waiting for dawn. As soon as the first rays of sunlight lit up the clearing, we packed up camp as quickly as possible and began the hike back, always alert to any sounds around us. None of us spoke much during the journey, but we knew we would never forget that night. We went to Yellowstone seeking adventure and found something far beyond what we expected.